All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This webinar is part of the Greenlight webinar series hosted by the Institute for Transportation Studies at the University of California, Davis, and features research funded by the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. My name is Colin Murphy. I'm the Policy Director for the National Center for Sustainable Transportation based here at UC Davis. Following the presentation, we're going to have a Q&A session where we will take questions from the audience. To ask a question, please use the Q&A button located in the Zoom window, or you can put it in the chat window. With the Q&A window makes it a little easier on us. Our speaker today is Lisa Altman-Hall, the Vermont Associate Director for the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. Lisa is going to be joined by two special guest respondents, Rebekah Anderson, who is a transportation engineer at the Ohio DOT Office of Statewide Planning and Research, and Karen Faussett, manager of the Michigan DOT Office of Statewide and Urban Travel Analysis. I will now turn it over to Lisa Altman-Hall.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. I am indeed the University of Vermont's transportation professor, but I'm speaking to you today from my sabbatical location at UC Davis, and I want to thank the whole team here for hosting me so well. Rebekah really is in Ohio, and Karen really is in Michigan, and I'm so grateful for them being willing to join me on this webinar today. We'll do a 30-minute presentation by me summarizing an NCST white paper, and then Rebekah and Karen will each speak about what's going on in their state in terms of long-distance travel, data collection and modeling for 8 to 10 minutes each, and then Colin will lead us in the questions and answers. The National Center for Sustainable Transportation is a consortium of 6 universities spread throughout the country. It is a national UTC, a USDOT UTC program, and like all UTCs, we have research, education, and engagement in our mission. But there's 2 things we do a little bit differently and try to emphasize. One of them is that instead of just doing the sort of university research projects we're all used to, we also have been doing a series of white papers on critical issues. And this long distance topic today is indeed an NCST white paper. And the fact that Rebekah and Karen are joining us is the second kind of unique thing we try to do at the NCST, and that is to be really engaged with policymakers and practitioners and have them involved with our research and education programming. The white paper incorporating long-distance travel into transportation planning in the United States was kind of a special double-sized white paper. I had to ask special permission from our program manager to make it double-sized. I had done a lot of background literature review looking at the history of what had been done in the United States in addition to the current research, and I wanted to get that all down. And so what we'll do today is really have an overview of the policy issues, factors, the challenges, the opportunities in long-distance travel planning, but we won't be able to get into depth and everything, and I invite you to our website to look at the white paper or to email me with follow-up questions if you want more details. We'll talk first about what exactly is long-distance travel, and then talk about estimating how that travel demand has changed in the United States over time. We're the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, so we'll tell you a little bit about why we think long-distance travel is important to sustainability, specifically talk about emissions, economy, and social equity. Then I'll tell you some of the results from prior long-distance travel research, and then finally conclude with sort of my recommendations coming out of writing the white paper about how we need to move ahead with long-distance travel data collection so we can do national travel demand modeling in the United States. Of course, long-distance travel is not a new topic. Humans have been traveling for centuries, but it was only when we moved to the 1900s with automobiles and then post-1950 with jets that long-distance travel really started being undertaken by the masses of people. And as a result, the volume of long-distance travel has risen to the level of being a critical issue for those of us that are thinking about how to manage, design, plan for, operate a sustainable transportation system. Long-distance travel was indeed the original focus of federal transportation planning in the United States. Before 1950, the planning and the infrastructure was all about railroads, and then U.S. routes, and then the interstate highway system. But in 1950, we kind of had this shift or this redirect in federal transportation policy. We had significant urban traffic congestion issues, significant urban housing issues, and the federal program really made a shift, being focused more towards urban areas. And as a result, the transportation planning agencies and models that we have, and the legacy really of that era, are very urban focused. The leaders in long distance travel modeling in the United States are a limited number of states, who have recognized that long distance travel is important for making their statewide model better. But I would say today we want to think beyond that, not to just making statewide planning better, but to saying how do we have a nationally sustainable, integrated, effective, multimodal transportation system, and how do we model long distance travel in that? And we see that starting recently, leadership from the Federal Highway Administration. In 2015, they released the county-to-county origin-destination matrices called the Traffic Analysis Framework. In 2015, they also released their simulation-based annual activity model of county-to-county, actually a little bit smaller than county travel, developed by RSG. And then now we have planning and talk about incorporating long-distance travel data collection in next-gen NHTS, the National Household Transportation Survey. So it's right and proper to kind of start with, well, what is long-distance travel? We kind of all have a sense of it. It's out-of-town trips. They might be overnight, they might not be. Inner-city trips. Could be work, could be personal, but we've been really hung up on a 50 or 100-mile definition, having a really black and white definition. And I think it's been a bit of a barrier to how we move forward. We all know that 50 miles is kind of a silly threshold. Many commutes are longer than that. We have mega regions, metropolitan areas that are much larger than that now, and it doesn't really make sense to have a hard and fast line defined by distance. So I'll ask you to just put that aside for a little bit and to know that we're talking about intercity, interregional trips, trips that are out of town, away from home. So the premise of our work and thinking about long distance travel for us on this research team is that truly creating a sustainable global transportation system is going to require a national travel demand model. And that's going to need robust data. We believe it's going to need to be annual in its framework, and it's going to need to be overnight based. Defining overnight makes a lot of sense for reasons we'll talk about today, and then it needs to be a really meaningful integration of surface and air modes. Airports have kind of been these special trip generators in our urban and state models, but really the travelers in today's society are making meaningful decisions about using surface and air modes between similar origins and destinations, and it really makes sense to integrate those things, which is particularly hard. One of the reasons we haven't had a lot of travel demand modeling to do our planning with is that we've lacked long distance data. And so the first data that we still really use quite extensively, believe it or not, is the American Travel Survey from 1995. It was defined as 100 miles from home. It was collected for a whole year. And because it was a whole year, that's the reason we still use it. It gives us the seasonality. It gives us the trip rate for an individual person per year. And that's really important if you're trying to do activity simulation for the advanced types of travel demand models we have today. In 2001, the National Household Transportation Survey tried to merge the long and daily surveys together. And we ended up with a sample size of long distance travel that was a little bit too small to be able to be used in a statistically robust way at the level below the national scale. And so we do see some choice models about travel decisions coming out of this survey. It is a good, robust survey, but it doesn't get used as much as you would expect because of that 4-week retrospective lacking the annual details. Next, in 2003, Ohio, and we have Rebekah here from Ohio with us today, and we'll hear more about Ohio, did quite a large long-distance travel survey in 2003. And then shortly thereafter, Michigan, Colorado, and Utah also did state long-distance travel surveys. And these were important surveys because they gave us updated glimpses of what was factoring into long-distance travel, but also because we learned a lot of things about how to measure long-distance travel and the ways it didn't really quite work. We learned that people had a lot of recall problems, that distance estimation was a challenge for the participants, and that getting a representative large enough sample was really, really hard. In 2013, California did a particularly large long-distance add-on with their daily household travel survey, and 42,000 households ended up being in this 8-week retrospective of long-distance travel. This is what I would call the most recent large survey we have of long-distance travel in the United States, but unfortunately, we also learned from that survey how unwieldy it could be to really try to collect a representative large sample of of long-distance travel. And it's one of the reasons you'll hear me recommending today that we need to embrace convenience samples as a way to really understand the trip details and the personal trip details and how they influence long-distance travel choice. My colleague, Dr. Jeff Lamondia of Auburn University, and I did our own kind of unique long-distance survey in 2013. This was the first year-long long-distance travel survey since 1995 in the United States. We started with 1,220 people, and over 50% of them stayed with us for a whole year, reporting their travel monthly. And this is where we experimented with a couple of things. First of all, the overnight definition, which really resonated with participants and worked for modeling over space and over the year. And we also were using a web-based platform to allow for the geocoding of ODs. Michigan did another survey in 2015, and it is quite a detailed survey, so it is the most recent long-distance survey in the U.S. where we can understand the types of trips being made by people. And Ohio is currently doing a survey, and the interesting thing about Ohio's current study and project is that they're using a mobile app called FarMove to actually have a passive semi-passive mobile device data collection in the long-distance arena, which I think is really, really important that we be experimenting with that approach. And then it's interesting to think about the 2017 National Household Transportation Survey, which in the national survey included no long-distance travel at all, but 6 states added little questions about how many trips greater than 50 miles or greater than 75 miles have you taken in the last 2 months. And this is interesting, and it's going to be an interesting way to look at a little bit of stuff about long-distance travel in 2017. But in reality, it just reminds us that really it's very, very hard to get the trip details and the personal details you need for all of those long-distance trips in a nationally representative sample. We need to find alternative ways. So we know we have some challenges. Defining long-distance travel, the study period, burden, representativeness, the cost of getting these large generalizable samples going, but we have solutions. And I think the solutions really do involve both origin destination derived from passive mobile devices and convenience sample surveys. And I think that's going to allow us to get the 1 year of data that we need to be able to meaningfully model long-distance travel. And it's going to allow us to have a geography that is global in scale, because really that's what many people in our transportation system are doing. I'd be remiss if I didn't remind us that Europe has also been doing a lot of long-distance data collection and research. They've had long-distance in their national surveys since about 1990. They've tried to make an effort to standardize their data collection EU-wide. They are also kind of trapped in a distance-based definition, which I would say they need to move away from. But they have an advantage over us in the U.S. in that interviews and phone surveys are still quite feasible with decent response rates in Europe. So how has long-distance travel demand changed over time? Wouldn't it be nice if we could look back at these surveys and somehow say, well, what is the growth? How has it changed over decades? But we really can't do that because we haven't been doing the same survey in a consistent way over decades to be able to track long-distance travel over time. So to say something about long-distance travel over time, we have to go to the traffic volume data that's maintained by the USDOT and the Bureau of Transportation Statistics. And what you see on this slide is actually the passenger miles by commercial air as recorded at the BTS for both domestic flights and international flights. And what we see, if going back only to 2002, is that air travel is growing in terms of miles, and that international travel is growing at a higher rate, and that it is now more significant than domestic air travel. Of course, we want to know about more than just air, and the BTS also records passenger miles by intercity rail and by motor coach. And if we combine the passenger miles traveled by intercity rail, air, and motor coach, we're excluding commuter rail, we're excluding transit bus, what we see is that that has grown as a percentage of all travel, looking back to 1960 in this case, in this graph. And in 2017, 19% of the passenger miles traveled in the U.S. were presumably long-distance travel because it was done on intercity rail, air, and motor coach. 19% is a pretty significant percentage, and the growth rate is pretty significant looking at this graph. Of course, the missing piece we'd like to know here is how many miles have been undertaken on the highway for long distance travel. And we can only sort of glean an approximation of this. And so what you see here on the slide in the blue line is the passenger miles of travel on the highway that have been undertaken in total from traffic counts. And that dip you see in about 2008 is actually a change in methodology and how USDOT was tracking the miles. And what you see in the red line is the estimate of passenger miles of travel for all of our daily travel from the National Household Travel Surveys that get conducted every 5 to 7 years. And so we can hypothesize that the difference between the total highway miles in passenger vehicles counted in all the states, the blue line, subtracting the daily travel, that difference, that gap between the blue and red is the long distance travel on highways. And if we add that long distance travel on highways to the air, motor coach, and rail, what we get is the purple line, and that at this point is about 30% of the passenger miles of travel in the United States. So this might come as a surprise to some of you. This might seem really high. 30% of the passenger miles of travel, certainly that might make us think we should be collecting data and we should be modeling. I think it's pretty realistic because the estimates in Europe are between 30 and 45% of the passenger miles are for those long distance journeys. So how does all this travel then factor in with sustainability? Why would the National Center for Sustainable Transportation be even funding a white paper on the topic of long distance travel? Well, all that travel corresponds to a lot of emissions, a lot of economic input, and a lot of questions about whether or not that travel is fairly distributed or whether there may be social equity and well-being questions related to it. There's certainly a lot of costs and a lot of benefits of long-distance travel. We know noise, water, air pollution, a lot of money, a lot of energy goes into long-distance travel, but then we get a lot of benefits from that. Cultural exchange, economic development, maintaining our social network, visiting friends and family. And whenever anything like this has such significant benefits and such significant costs to us as a society, one would think that there should be data collected on that system and that we should be deliberately designing that system and saying, hey, have we got the type of infrastructure, the type of long-distance travel system, the types of connections to the global society in America that we really should have for the best outcomes for our country. And I think that's where the gap is and where we as a professional community are moving to fill this gap about long-distance travel. Just want to raise a few points to think about related to emissions, economy, and equity so that as you think about the sustainability of long-distance travel moving forward, you can think about some of these complexities and what they mean for you personally and what they mean for you professionally. 28% of the greenhouse gases emitted in the United States are transportation, and only 9% of that 28%, 2% are 9% are air and 2% are rail. So I think we lull ourselves into a little false sense of security, kind of thinking we don't need to worry about long distance travel emissions yet. But I think that is false and that we do need to be worrying about it because we've seen on the prior slides that there's growth in this area and we don't want the greenhouse gas emissions growing from this sector. So when we think about the rail transportation and think about how do we integrate all these modes so we can have a comprehensive model of long distance travel, we often think that, oh gosh, rail is really great. Rail is the thing we need to be doing more of. And we just want to remember as we pursue that favorable profile of rail really requires full trains, that vehicle occupancy really matters. An empty train is really, really inefficient. And we know from recent research in California that the life cycle costs and the source of electricity are really important to consider when you look at how good or bad is a rail alternative. And finally, there's an increasing number of people in the field suggesting that conventional rail, as opposed to high-speed rail, really needs a reconsideration. It takes a lot of energy to go the high speeds of high-speed rail, and maybe really good conventional rail is something we should be considering in our portfolio. When we think about air transportation, I think it also has some complex details in order to integrate it into a multimodal national modeling system. First of all, it's not just sort of a trip from A to B, this many miles, so it's going to be this many emissions or this much energy for air and this many for driving. The number of takeoffs and landings really matter, the trip length, the extra miles flown. We don't know everything we want to know about emissions at altitude. We have to consider what access and egress modes people take. And we also have to somehow figure out what to do with all these private sector actors in the air transportation system. As public sector planners, we worry on the highway and surface side about equitable access to all places and all citizens in America. But airlines are understandably a business. They're worried about filling planes. They're not worried about whether their planes reach every corner of America and provide equitable access to all people. And we really can't ask them to do that. So how are we going to think about whether or not there's good long-distance accessibility everywhere in America? And finally, the last point I'll make on this slide is about motor coaches. I think that the relative merits of full motor coaches really need to be reconsidered. What we know in long-distance travel, and I think often distracts us, is that we all think we know, and it is kind of true on average, that airplanes have a very favorable emission rate or energy requirement per passenger mile moved. And that's absolutely true, that a full Boeing 737 has a better emission rate per passenger mile than an average vehicle with 1 or even 1.5 passengers in it. But you know what? A Prius and a full Boeing 37 are about the same amount of emissions, and a full Prius beats a full Boeing 737. But a full coach bus, in terms of the amount of energy and emissions per passenger mile, beats both the Prius and it beats the airplane by a lot. And so I think we need to rethink the potential for motor coaches in our long distance system. And I think we do see that in some parts of the United States. So in terms of economy, we kind of all know that travel is a lot of economic input, a lot of economic output, a lot of jobs. And we would, as planners, be kind of crazy if we said in the name of sustainability we wanted to limit travel. But I do think there is a big question that we can contribute to as thoughtful long-distance transportation planners, and that's this sort of idea of this iron law between VMT and gross domestic product. There is this sense that in order to have growth, you have to have travel growth. And we do see that in historic statistics. We see that when we bring air service to a region, countries in Africa, that economic development happens. But at some point, one has to argue that travel growth and economic growth become decoupled. And we're starting to see that that's true in some metropolitan areas in different parts of the globe. And I think we have to, as transportation planners, be questioning this idea that the two always go hand in hand and suggesting how we could have economic growth without so many miles of travel growth. Long-distance travel also relates to the social equity piece of sustainability. A lot of us have the misperception that all those long-distance trips, that the majority of them are for business or for work. And the data just doesn't back that up. This is data from that most recent Michigan survey, where we see that work travel is only about 13% of the long-distance trips. In my 2013 survey, it was 24%. Regardless of the exact percentage, the majority of long-distance trips are made for personal reasons, and a very big percentage of those personal trips are for visiting friends and family. And so long-distance travel, as social networks have come to first, is about maintaining social networks. It's about social capital. It's about being there for the important life events, the births of babies, weddings, funerals, and not to mention access to education and cultural exchange. So long-distance travel has become part of social access. And so we as transportation planners then need to start saying to ourselves, oh my goodness, all of our travel surveys, even if our long-distance travel surveys have been weak in some ways, they're only measuring trips that were actually realized, trips people actually took. What about measuring latent demand or unmet long-distance demand? We probably need to do that. We've done some interviews at the University of Vermont where people have told us that their lack of resources, their lack of time means they can't travel, and that it is affecting their well-being.
And I just want to remind everybody, we are going to have about a half hour for Q&A after this, so please start dropping some questions into the Q&A function or into the chat window, and we will take those as soon as we finish the presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Colin. So what do we know about long-distance travel then from these data collections that we have undertaken? Not a whole lot is the answer to that. We have some descriptive results on things that correlate with trip rates. We have very little, if any, research on trip destination choices. The folks in the vacation leisure literature do have some results there. And then we have very, very limited models of mode choice. Why do people pick air versus surface? In terms of trip rates, it's pretty consistently true in all of the studies and data that's been collected that as income increases, levels of long-distance travel increase. Higher income persons are more likely to fly, and we know that education is kind of a confounding variable that we're sort of unable to weed out. Men travel more for long distance than women. There may be cohort effects over time that we don't fully know about yet. Some studies have shown that women travel more for leisure, but that has not been a consistent result across multiple studies. Older and younger people travel less than middle-aged adults, and we don't know fully the reasons for this. It could relate to income. It could also relate to limited mobility that comes along with aging, unfortunately. Pretty consistently, a limited number of studies have shown that the more children in a household, there's fewer long-distance trips, although this is not always the case, especially when you start interacting children with income variables. We do seem to see consistently, though, that single parents travel less. Urban versus rural comes up as a factor in trip rate for long-distance travel. Urban dwellers travel more, potentially because of airport access, income, or lifestyle. We don't really know why. And then we have other studies that show rural residents are making more long-distance surface trips, possibly to access services such as medical care or maybe groceries and employment. And then finally, just one study that we've done at Vermont has shown that people who travel for work do not make fewer personal trips. So they make more total trips, but the personal trips of people who travel for work and people who don't travel for work are about the same. And I think that speaks to the importance of long-distance travel in our personal social lives at this point. So why exactly is it we don't have mode choice models? You know, those emission statistics I kind of spit out really quickly to you about which mode is more efficient per passenger mile, it kind of makes you think we should be looking at how to rebalance the portfolio to have fewer emissions in the long distance transportation system. Well, it turns out that getting the attributes of the choices between an origin and destination, especially for an air trip, is a really, really hard thing to do. So what we see on this graph on the screen right now is that on-road travel distances are easy to get, and even travel times, congested travel times from online mapping software. But to get that airport information, there may be multiple ways to fly from A to B. There's the access, the egress, the number of transfers, the transfer time, different prices. And it's just a really complicated thing to do to understand what the mode choices are for a long distance trip. And we need to be motivated to do this. We see examples of the air and surface system coming together. General aviation helicopters have been around a long time, but now we're talking about electric vertical takeoff and landing planes, shorter range air services. Airport leakage is a term you might not know. That's when people drive to a more distant airport, particularly with large parties, to get a cheaper airfare. So that really illustrates how the surface and air systems are just completely integrated. So what do we do? After writing this white paper, what would I suggest we do as a profession, as a team that cares about long distance transportation? Well, I think we do need to move to further development of the national model. I think this national travel model needs to be a complement, and we need to connect our daily regional models and our state models to it. I think that national model needs to be overnight in nature. If we think about the data that we collect, so let's just keep talking while Colin and Leon play with my computer here. So I guess what I was suggesting is that we need to have both a national travel model and a daily regional model. And that national travel model needs to deal with overnight trips. We need to have annual activity simulations of overnight travel, overnight locations. We know that overnight locations are what the people who do our surveys can report to us easily. We know that we can have surface and air integrated if we start talking about overnight travel, and that we can make meaningful global connections in that national travel model. So how do we get what we need to make that national model? I think there's 4 key actions we as transportation planners need to undertake in order to do this. First of all, I think we all know we're going to move towards utilizing big data to have national origin destination information. And so that's great. That's going to be origin destination data for long distance travel that we've really never had. It's going to be on a scale we've never had. Unfortunately, for those of us who are demand modelers, it's not going to have the trip detail or the person details that we really need to have the choice models that activity simulations or any other type of national demand model is going to want to have embedded. So in order to get the information about what choices people make in the long distance system, I think we need to embrace convenient sample surveys. That's where we're going to get our understanding of how people are making decisions. They're not going to be representative, but they're going to be good, robust, convenient samples from which we can have good choice models. And we know from our prior experiments that getting a large representative sample over a whole year is just not doable. It's not feasible on cost alone. And then, in order to complement that, since the convenience samples will be populated with travelers, we need to start paying attention to the non-travelers. Are there people who lack access in the long-distance system? We know that we worry about people having access to food, jobs, school, medical care in our home communities and in our local transportation planning. We need to start saying, are there people that need to get between communities that have challenges with that access? And then finally, number 4, you know, I don't really feel like people talk about long distance travel a lot. I find myself sometimes in the lunch line at transportation conferences, and people ask what I do, and I say, well, I've really been studying long distance travel lately. And they get these blank stares, like I've said the most boring thing on the face of the planet. And I've tried a lot of ways to talk about it. It's really hard to get people engaged. It's really encouraging to have all you out there on this webinar today. But how do we, those of us who are on the webinar, start a discussion in the broader transportation planning community with professionals about the role of long-distance travel in our society, but also really amongst the public. We have an awful lot of people in the public talking about, gosh, they wish they biked to work, or wouldn't it be great if they could take the bus to work, but we don't have people really talking about the implications of their air travel and their long-distance travel. And I'm not suggesting we need to eliminate long-distance travel. I'm suggesting we need to undertake it in a thoughtful, more meaningful way, both as planning professionals and as in our personal lives. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to Rebekah and ask her how they think about long distance travel data and modeling and planning in Ohio.
Thanks, Lisa. Okay, so Ohio is, well, in the Midwest. So I figured I'd throw up a few facts about Ohio. We do have the 4th largest interstate lane miles in the country. It's enough to travel between LA and DC 2.5 times. We have a lot of VMT. We're also within 600 miles or 1 day's drive of 60% of the US and Canadian population. We have a ton of ton of airports, including 7 of which are commercial, one of which is an inland port. We have a good number of jobs, and well, that's our GSP. Next. Thanks. So the main use for our long distance data is for our statewide model. So our statewide model is a disaggregate tour-based model or a simple activity-based model if you prefer. So we are micro-simulating every person and household in the state plus a halo around the state. And then we are micro-simulating each person's travel patterns for a day. And so the way our passenger models work, the long distance trips are prioritized. So if each synthetic person is making a long distance trip, that amount of that day is no longer available for short distance trips. So they can either make a half-day trip in the morning or the afternoon, or a full-day long-distance trip. So that would be there and back again, all on the taking the entire day. Or they could be away on travel, in which case that person goes to the visitor model. As mentioned, if there's time available after long-distance trips, then they can make additional short-distance trips. One of the reasons we're looking at 50 miles is because we want something that's long enough that people have to plan that trip for their day. So if you're going out to dinner, you don't say, oh, let's go to this restaurant 50 miles away. If you're going to a restaurant 50 miles away, you plan that first and then you plan your day around it. It's worth noting that we're participating in the Next Gen NHTS specifically for the national data. In the bottom right corner, you can see a picture of our statewide model network. And as you can see, it does cover the continental US plus Canada. It's also worth noting that our model has been used in the last 20 years to plan and look at new freeways. So we are using it specifically for the rural travel and the long distance travel. So we're doing a household survey, and that includes a long distance survey. Obviously, oh, sorry, go back. Obviously, we're collecting a ton of data. To participate in the survey, you did have to complete the 1-week household travel survey on your smartphone, but you also have to own that own smartphone. And as Lisa mentioned earlier, we're asking you to download our Move on it. So the phone app automatically figures out when you have traveled outside of a cordon from your home, and it generates a travel survey that you then actively select all of the data that comes out of it. One of the things we noted is that people are making a good number of medical or personal business trips. So that is that gray bar off to the left there, that's 4%. So 4% of our long distance trips are for like medical reasons, including 1.5% of overnight lodging is in medical facilities. There are a good number of people in Ohio as well as outside of Ohio who are traveling to the Cleveland Clinic for a lot of medical studies. And it's getting pretty substantial. The other thing I will note is that dark blue slice up near the top is, it says 3%. That's our escorting trips. So these are people either taking other people to, say, medical appointments or perhaps dropping their child off at school. 3%, you know, most people, when you're thinking of long distance trips, you're not thinking, oh, I'll just accompany somebody on this really long trip, but they're doing it. Okay, next. So here's our use of passive data, otherwise known as big data. So we can buy these location-based services data, and we're generally using it to get our information about the size of our through travel. Obviously, as Lisa mentioned, it doesn't have any information attached to it, and so we're using our surveys to figure out exactly what the information is, but we're trying to get the size from the passive data. One of the projects we're looking at doing soon is the 2024 eclipse is going to be passing through Ohio, and so we're trying to figure out what is the size of the population wanting to come to Ohio to view that eclipse, and how to plan for that, including where we need to not have construction on our roads. Okay, that's it for Ohio.
Thanks so much, Rebekah. Karen, tell us about Michigan.
Okay, so this slide just has some background information on Michigan. We've got about 10 million people, over 100 billion annual vehicle miles of travel in 2017. We have a very large public road system, and just an interesting tidbit is that Detroit is the busiest commercial border crossing with Canada, and Port Huron, which is just to the north of Detroit, is the third busiest. We're actually starting construction with Canada now on another bridge between Detroit and Windsor, Ontario, that will be open in, I think, the next 3 years or so. Next slide. So why is long distance data important to us in Michigan? First, we realized it's something that's not captured by our daily household travel surveys. And we wanted to know how much long distance travel occurs within the state. We know anecdotally that we have a lot of up north travel, which is people from southern Michigan going to northern Michigan to their second homes or to vacation. But we didn't have any idea of the magnitude of that travel that's in-state compared to, other long-distance destinations. And then also looking at the map, you can see that we have a great deal of rural area in the state. That's the light blue area. And that's portions of the state that are outside of a metropolitan planning organization boundary. And for our long-range transportation plan, we want to know if these rural residents are making trips and having to travel long distances for basic services like medical or shopping. And then finally, being that our state is two peninsulas, we want to kind of know, does their geography impact how residents do their long distance travel? We know that we don't have a lot of travel, long distance travel into the state other than people who are destined for Michigan simply because of our geography. So we've done 3 household travel surveys in the past 15 years or so, and for each of those surveys we did a long distance retrospective component. The slide shows our travel log, the long distance travel log that we had in our most recent survey that was provided to participants, but then they also could just, there was an online version that they could also complete. All household members in each of the 3 surveys were asked to report all the trips that they had taken in the past 3 months that were more than 100 miles from home, and then how often did they take that trip in the past 12 months. And along with that, they reported their modes that they took to the destination, the modes that they used while they were there, their trip purposes, the duration of their trip, and what household members were on the trip with them. So here's just a few travel characteristics that we've gotten from our most recent long distance survey. Looking at the graph on the left, you can see that for basic services, medical and shopping, the percent of long distance trips varies across different areas of the state. But for the residents that are in rural northern Michigan, 9% of their long distance trips are for medical. And then 5% of the long distance trips are for medical purposes in our small cities, and those are the 5,000 to 50,000 population cities that are outside of an MPO area. And then, as you can see in the larger metro areas, very few residents are traveling long distance for those services. So one of the things that we're looking at as we're developing our new state long-range transportation plan is in these rural areas of our state, over time we have projections that the population is going to decrease and that the population is going to significantly increase. So how does the fact that they're having to travel long distance for these basic services, how is our changes in demographics over the next 20 to 25 years going to impact how we plan for transportation in those areas? And then on the right, you can see that Michiganders like to stay in our state, and that more than half the long distance trips stay within Michigan. And then looking at mode of travel for the long distance trips taken by Michigan residents, overwhelmingly they travel by private vehicle, and that the distance traveled by private vehicle is the least distance of the other modes, and that the distance traveled does vary greatly by mode. So we just finished up the development of our new statewide travel demand model in Michigan. And in looking at all the data that we had available for long distance travel in the model, it was determined that our daily household travel survey would be the source of most of the long distance data that we used in developing the model. And this stemmed from the difference in the definition of the long distance in the model versus the survey. In the survey, we asked for 100-mile distance, whereas in the model that we developed, long distance was classified as 50 miles. And then also, there was a concern that there may be an underreporting of long distance trips due to the retrospective nature of the survey. But we did use the long distance survey for the air travel rates The consensus was that people would remember to report their air trips due to their infrequency as compared to the trips by auto. But we did purchase big data that we use as the basis for pivoting off of for the long distance trips. So we are using that passive data collection as a large component for our origins and destinations for those long distance trips in the model.
All right, thank you very much, Karen, and thank you both and your teams in Michigan and Ohio for sort of being leaders nationwide and sort of pushing the long distance transportation planning and data forward. Colin.
Sure. All right, so we're going to get into the Q&A and discussion. We are planning to continue this webinar for the next 25 minutes, so we have, I hope, plenty of time to have a good discussion. There are several questions coming in. Please add more, and we will try to get to them all, and if we can't get to them all, we may follow up with you offline. I will, where the person's name comes with the question, I will read the name as well. My apologies in advance if I mispronounce anyone's name. The first is, I think, more of a comment from Zappaletto, and that was that airlines may keep bereavement ticket discount requests as a data set that could help in long distance modeling. So for anybody interested in that question, that sounds useful. So the first question we had was, do you know of or expect any mobility as a service companies targeting long distance travel?
I don't know specific detailed examples, but I think that we do absolutely know, and we see it increasingly in the travel surveys, that you know, TNCs are being used for what we term long distance travel. I myself recently took a TNC for a long distance trip because there was 4 in my travel party, and it was more convenient and cheaper than finding my way to the Amtrak station to return by train. So it's it's a great illustration of how you have to consider the whole trip, the access, the egress, and how the travel time and the cost and the travel party all work together. So I absolutely think that these new mobility options are going to be in the long distance realm. And there's also a number of research groups looking at how automated vehicles are going to be in the long distance realm. And we need to get that characterizing of the air travel full trip from the real origin to the real destination straight, so we can more accurately estimate what automated vehicles are going to do in this system.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that is there's a lot of interest and some commercial deployment of motor coaches on certain routes in California. We have things like what's called a super bus, as well as somebody's proposed an overnight bus between, you know, San Francisco and Los Angeles. Those might fall into the same idea and become part of a unified mobility as a service package. The next question that we have is, do you have any insights as to long distance frequency or preferences or usage by younger generations versus older generations, like millennials and Gen Z versus Gen X and baby boomers?
So there are definitely patterns in long distance travel that are a function of age, and we see those in the data sets, but we have been unable to clarify cohort effects or generational effects because of not having consistent longitudinal data over time. And so we also have the interaction of sort of money. The resources you have at your disposal will determine the number of miles you travel, but also whether or not you can take the faster modes to do those miles. But I do think we see the young people with the sort of millennial studies we've had about the millennials who are choosing to maybe live longer in urban areas and live car-free, that they are sort of more inclined to be taking air travel trips and saving money for air travel from other things in their budget. But I think we also have to say to ourselves, well, all of us are flying more than we did 10 years ago and more than we did 20 years ago. So that may not be purely a generational thing or an attitude thing. It's many things sort of acting together.
Great. So the next question is there any hint in the recent data that increasing congestion is discouraging people from doing long trips by car?
Karen and Rebekah, do you want to chime in on that at all?
We haven't seen that in Ohio. Generally, although it's worth noting that congestion in Ohio is not like congestion in Southern California.
And I would concur with exactly what Rebekah said.
Yeah, so, and we, you know, anecdotally from living in Vermont, I do know that one of the benefits of taking the short flight into New York City is that you don't have to deal with New York City congestion, and you don't have to deal with the expense of parking your car when you get there. So I think that those who work along the I-95 corridor, as well as those that work in the congested areas in the West Coast, know that traffic congestion impacts travel decisions, and we know that it must be impacting mode choices. We just haven't had the data to model it in a meaningful way.
As a California native, I can absolutely say congestion influences some of the travel decisions, like the time you choose to leave. People will often get up at very early or travel very late to avoid congestion. But whether the effect is broader than that, I certainly don't know. The next question is from Venu Grikapati. So what are your thoughts on the impact of automation on long distance travel, good or bad, particularly on mode shifts from short hop flights to automated vehicles and induced demand for long distance travel with increased market penetration of automated vehicles?
Yes, Venu, I basically agree with you. I think there's good and bad. I agree with Pat Mokhtarian and her recent papers and Dean lecture at TRB last year that there's going to be this increasing passengerization of travel, and that is going to mean that we've kind of created time. So now all of a sudden we have more time in the day because we don't need to drive, and so we're going to reallocate that time, and we're going to reallocate it to activities, and we're going to reallocate it to more travel, and we don't know what the balance is going to be. But certainly if you can go that 50 plus miles to the restaurant, I think Rebekah was talking about, and you start in your, you know, with your friends in an automated vehicle, and you have cocktails on the way, that's going to be part of the social experience that's going to be going on in the automated vehicle. So I do kind of think that some of those sort of fantasy Jetson style visions we have are going to be real, and that whole travel time factor is going to change how we travel in the overall system. It is going to mean more long distance travel. I do hope that we can get a handle on which flights we want those surface trips to replace, because what we need is a portfolio of mobility options, not just air, not just highway, but hopefully meaningful motor coach and meaningful rail in more corridors. And then if we could say to ourselves, which flights does it not make sense to do? Oftentimes the flight from New York to Philadelphia comes up as a great example of a short hop flight that we really need to be replaced by other modes, but certainly having more choices is always a good thing. In the whole automated vehicle for long distance, a piece that I do worry about is that social equity piece. If we're really creating choices for the wealthy and not ensuring a portfolio of choices for everyone. But I absolutely agree with you that there's going to be this change in long distance because of automated vehicles.
And I would be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to point out that there have been several studies at UC Davis on the likely impact of automated vehicles on travel demand, several of which were funded by NCST. In general, it's very early in the research, but the consensus indication is you're likely to see an increase in travel demand for the reason Lisa said, because it sort of reduces the personal value of time lost to travel. So I recommend several of those papers. The next question is...
Hold on. In Ohio, I just wanted to add, in Ohio, we are looking at this. We are installing connected vehicle and automated vehicle technologies on an extended freeway corridor. And so I think if you can marry some of that with some level 2 and level 3 charging stations, I think you can get a holistic approach, you know, for your long distance travel that way.
Thank you, Karen. That's a very good idea. We are certainly big believers in Rebekah, my apologies. But we're definitely very big believers in trying to unify automation with electrification and sharing.
Karen, anything to add from the Michigan point of view in terms of automated, connected, or electric?
Well, you know, we are a major hub for the development of, you know, connected and autonomous vehicles. And in the development of our state long range plan that we're undertaking now, we're trying to determine scenarios to consider as far as how, whether things develop quickly or not as quickly as we imagine, and how the economy and the pricing of all this works, what our future might look like, so that we can better plan for it.
All right, thank you. We have time for probably 2 or 3 more questions. The next one is, do you have any insight into the threshold of travel distance or total cost that would influence the choice of long distance travel mode?
So the TRB special report that came out about 2 years ago now, I think, looking at trips over 500 miles, was suggesting that that was a threshold over which you would always fly. In our longitudinal study, which was the year 2013 to 2014, we saw flying trips less than 200 miles, and we saw driving trips over 500. So I tend to think that there's a sort of competitive range in there, 250 to 750 miles, where both modes are being used. We also had sort of a larger number of people in California, Alabama, and Vermont in our study. And one of the things that we saw is that, of course, the geography of opportunities for travel around you impacts what mode you take. Is there flight service? Are there even cities that are 250 miles away from you? So I'm a big believer in needing to sort of account for that accessibility landscape around the origin and the home region that you're talking about as you think about these things. And I want to reply to a comment about retitling my report interregional or overnight, because I think Colin's skipping that question because it's a little bit critical. I don't mind at all. I think you're absolutely right that I'm as guilty as anyone for using the phrase long distance when really we need to be moving to interregional and overnight. And I have to tell you, when I started using overnight about 5 years ago, I got a lot of cynicism in the research community, and it's starting to be much more embraced now. So thank you for making that comment, and I will do it.
I was skipping for time rather than due to critical. I have no problems with critical questions, especially when they're not directed at me. Next question, it sounds like long distance travel accounts for about 10% of the total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, 30% of 30%. How should we, planners, policymakers, et cetera, think about these emissions as states try to curtail transportation greenhouse gas emissions?
I think there's 2 pieces there. One is that we need to be worrying more about filling vehicles, all types of vehicles, whether they're airplanes, cars, trains, or buses. And we need to be talking about electrifying the passenger transportation system. I'm very fortunate that I've spent a couple of semesters in California at Davis since 2012. And every time I go back to Vermont, which is a particularly pro-electric vehicle state, I'm always amazed by how it's not really assumed and not really known that there's a consensus that we have to electrify the passenger transportation system. But I think that we as planners need to be more proactive about that than we are. It's going to take a long time to do that, and the sooner we get on it, the better.
Karen or Rebekah, would you like to chime in on this question?
No.
Well, I would just say, oh, go ahead.
No, I'm good, thanks.
Okay, so I would just say, as someone who primarily works on energy systems and alternative fuels, I absolutely agree with the idea that the long-term future of sustainable transportation, certainly for on-road passenger transportation, is going to be overwhelmingly, if not entirely, electric. I would also say, in between now and that future, there is a role for alternative fuels, particularly biofuels, to shave some of the emissions out of the system. And to work with the legacy fleet of vehicles. So, you know, it's as usual a portfolio approach. Last question we have in the queue. So if we still have a few minutes, so if there's a couple more questions, feel free to drop them in and we can probably get them. Right now, the last question is, how are car rentals accounted for in long-distance modeling, as this is a component of surface trips, especially from airports?
Yeah, the answer is not really well. So in the mode choice modeling that we're doing right now, which is not in the white paper that this webinar was about, but we're using 3 different long-distance data sets, and we've assumed 30 minutes to exit the airport and then just an uncongested travel time from the airport to your ultimate destination, whether you're in a rental car or a personal vehicle. And that 30-minute exit time is, we realize, is a really crude compromise between what would be experienced by someone being picked up and by somebody needing to sort of take the train and go get a rental car. And so I think the answer to your question is not really well. And I think it is important. I'm assuming, I don't know who all is listening out there. I know there's many of you, but I'm assuming that most of you are sort of surface transportation planning planners or planning modelers. And I think we need to turn the attention to thinking about what type of air system we want in the overall portfolio. That's something we just haven't done, or we haven't had time to do, and that it's becoming increasingly important how these 2 modes integrate together. And we don't really want just airport growth to be out of control the way highway growth was, or for airplanes to just service where it's financially feasible. We really want to think deliberately about, what type of air system do we want overlaid with our surface transportation system in America, and how do we together sort of try to direct our infrastructure and operations in that direction? And the exciting thing about that is it's really, really interesting to think about air transportation as somebody who has trained and worked for years in surface transportation, mostly on bicycles. I've loved learning about air transportation. I have so much more to learn, but it is a completely different world, a completely different system. And this whole question about a rental car, it's sort of got pieces and parts to it that we're not used to. And I think that it's time to invest in that learning.
Yes, I do believe there's going to be a forthcoming, probably next year, report out of NCST on mode choice for airport ingress and egress. So not an answer now, but stay tuned, it might be there. Since we have a couple minutes left, I will ask one of my sort of blue sky questions. So Lisa, assume you were a decision maker at federal DOT and you had $10 million to either do, collect data or do modeling to improve our understanding of that. What would you do if you had, that modest amount of resources and the authority to go ahead and do it?
You said 10 million?
10 million.
Well, I think that's probably about the amount that they may be thinking for the next gen NHTS. I kind of think that the Federal Highway Administration is thinking the right way about national data. I don't know exactly what Danny Jenkins and his team are thinking about, but I think they're thinking about big data to get a national OD. I worry about how small states like Vermont will be able to afford to participate in getting the detailed data, but I think having that data available for everyone is a really great start. And then I would hope that we can all invest in a series of convenient sample surveys to get the details of the choices people are making, so that FHWA can update its annual overnight activity model to not have it based on the 1995 data, which is a little silly. And then I would hope we could spend a little of that 10 million doing some qualitative interview-based research, understanding how there may be people in our society who have very, very little access to destinations at distance, and understanding how we might be able to provide some level of service to those people. We don't even know who those people are, let alone what their needs are. And so I think we have an obligation to do that.
All right, well, we are coming to the end of our time. I would like to thank all of you for joining us on this webinar. We'll be sending out a follow-up email, which will include the slides from the presentation as well as a survey regarding your impressions of this webinar. And it will also help us decide on future webinar topics, future webinar formats. Please try to take the time to fill out the survey. I know you probably all get a lot of surveys, but it is important. We view ourselves as trying to provide a service to the community, which is you all, to help inform policy and make sure that our research is relevant in both content and in how we present it. So please take the time to return that, or just reach out to us and contact us on anything, both in terms of research needs, assistance locating some of the resources that NCST has produced over the years, or ideas on how to share our work. I would definitely like to thank Karen and Rebekah from Michigan and Ohio, respectively, for offering their time to join this webinar and to offer their perspective on that. And if there are unless there are any other questions coming right now, I think we will finish and give you 5 minutes of your morning or afternoon back. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Lisa, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Colin. Bye-bye.